in my chair.
That's
the one who pushed me here today. We have Dr. David Carter, another brilliant professor, and Dr. Bob Paul, who is the most brilliant ethics professor of all. Does that help? We have in the back my husband, my living husband on the camera, and then you've seen the two little children running around. That's Ariel and Justin. And I'm so happy everybody else is with me today. So I think I'm going to start. Okay. All right. I'd like to welcome you for joining me. Thank you for joining me on this very special day where we're going to be talking about a topic that I fell in love with a few years ago. But before I go into it, I wanted to share some of the passion behind my research. I grew up in a relatively disadvantaged household. Experienced social problems, economic problems, domestic problems, a real cesspool of life. And in my environment, I witnessed that people did what they had to do to get by. That even good people, kind people, even they ended up having to make a wrong decision every once in a while. And at night, I would have a conversation with these people in my head, and I would say to them, there's some thing happening within you, and that thing caused you to make a bad decision today. And the funny thing about this thing is that it impacted people in different ways. That would mean people or bad people, when the opportunity presented itself, they actually ended up making the right decision. And so this thing that drives and moves people to do both good and bad is what I present to you today. But instead of calling it that thing, I'll call it ethical reasoning. And the title of this dissertation is Nurturing the Ethical Reasoning of Leaders, the Illumination of Ethics Education, Demographics, and Teaching Methods. Let me introduce you with a quote that goes like this. It's often said that a picture can paint 1,000 words, but I always wondered if the opposite could happen. Can a word speak 1,000 pictures? When, for example, somebody says the word crime, images that might come to mind are a petty liquor store theft or a gruesome murder scene in the forest. When somebody says the word technology, the images that might come to mind are a supercomputer, a cloned human being, or maybe even a telephone. So what kind of images come to mind when the word Enron is spoken? When I think of Enron, I think of men in expensive business suits making secret phone calls, pouring monstrous amounts of money into secret bank accounts. But perhaps in the world of education, the images that are spoken by the word Enron are sleeping accounting students during an ethics class, images of dilapidated books incapable of communicating ethical codes of conduct, or maybe images of a chronologically matured professor reading from his weathered old notes that he wrote so long ago.
Easy.
Carry on. So this is the environment that intrigues me, ethics education, the learning and teaching activities within. And to give you a background, education in general seeks to teach knowledge and skills. And when it comes to problems, it is skills that can help you maneuver through those problems to come to a resolution. And in the literature, one particular set of skills can enable you to make a decision in a moral dilemma known as ethical reasoning skills, which are said can be measured through an instrument known as a defining issues test. From those processes, I've identified a few gaps from which emerged the study. First of them being that it seems that there is an increase in the quantity of ethics education being offered, but not necessarily in the quality being offered. Also, there seems to be quite an increase in the amount of effort going into teaching ethics, but not necessarily assessment that goes into the learning of ethics. And finally, there's this idea that you teach ethics for a reason. That you don't teach ethics just because it's cool to teach. You teach that ethics has goals. And there's little evidence that these goals are being met. And so from those problems emerge my three purposes. The first of them being to determine if there are changes in ethical reasoning after exposure to an ethics class. And to see if one's demographics, what they're born with, has an impact in developing their ethical reasoning. And finally, to determine whether, or despite whether it's a teacher, a minister, or a parent, does the way in which you deliver ethics have an impact in your ethical reasoning? From those arose my three research questions, the first one being, is there a difference in the change in the ethical reasoning of those who were exposed versus not exposed to a core ethics course. My second research question is there a relationship between an individual's demographics and their ethical reasoning levels? And finally, is there an impact or a difference in ethical reasoning based on different teaching methods employed? And before we move on, I wanted to go over a couple of definitions so that we're all singing from the same sheet of music. First of them being, when we speak about principles, we're talking about guidelines for behavior. Values are preferences for various principles and values and morals deal with good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil. The DIT is the instrument I'll be using to measure ethical reasoning. It produces a P-score, which is the percentage of the time that individuals engage in post-conventional higher levels of ethical reasoning. Ethical reasoning is the cognitive part within you, the thinking part that responds to a moral dilemma. And a moral dilemma, by definition, is a conflict between two opposing values.